It's been proven in combat in every decade since its debut, prominently featured in hundreds of films and video games, and is to submachine guns what Kleenex is to tissues. Uzi does it. Today we have the opportunity to review Northeast Airsoft's rendition of this iconic subgun. The Uzi was designed by Uzi Gal, a colonel in the Israel Defense Forces following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. It is an extremely simple weapon, primarily constructed of stamped sheet metal, making it cheap to manufacture, and its use of a telescoping open-bolt design borrowed from the earlier CZ Model 25 allowed for a more compact overall profile compared to traditional submachine guns. The combination of simplicity, low cost, and relatively small size perfectly suited the IDF's needs for a commando weapon and PDW for rear echelon personnel, all on a shoestring budget. Israel Military Industries provided domestic manufacture, and so the Uzi was first fielded by Israeli Special Forces in 1954. In late 1956, the Uzi was prominently used in the Suez Crisis, which brought international attention to the gun. To meet this newfound commercial demand, IMI began export production to a wide variety of customers. While they would eventually license production to FN, most Uzis were produced in Israel by IMI to the specifications of the customer. IMI went on to design the Mini Uzi and Micro Uzi variants, along with the now iconic metal folding stock to replace the previous quick-detach wooden stock, but the basic design remains essentially unchanged, and, as far as we can tell, they're still making them. So with nearly 70 years of production and use by approximately half the world, including militaries, government agencies, private security, irregulars, and organized criminals, plus a variety of unlicensed rip-offs and civilian market versions, plus outright derivatives, there are a ton of variants that Northeast could have chosen to replicate. They elected to go with the German MP2A1. This is one of the Israeli production guns made for a foreign client, in this case the German Bundeswehr, and specifically the A1 variant denotes a later model with the metal folding stock. So this is a replica of an actual Israeli-made Uzi, not a copy, not licensed production, just intended for Germany rather than the IDF. With that all said, let's terminate the unsolicited history lesson here and get into the airsoft gun. We'll start with externals, and first things first, Northeast has done their due diligence in copying the materials, dimensions, and workmanship of the real thing. Everything that should be steel on the real gun is steel on the Northeast, finished with this excellent parkerizing appropriate to a military contract gun, with clean and square welds. We know some people were expecting a darker finish, as on this real Uzi, but gray is the authentic military finish, while this black is just paint that was applied over the parkerizing for commercial sale. We also know that the Northeast looked pretty light in the initial reveals, but part of why parkerizing is used as a military finish is because it absorbs oil, and rubbing oil into the parts has darkened it significantly. Lastly, these real Uzi magazines show how much variation there is between mil-spec Uzi parts in the first place, and the Northeast doesn't stand out as particularly different. Alright, enough with the 50 shades of gray, now let's go through specifics. From the front, the barrel is the standard 10-inch with no threading, secured via a threaded barrel nut to the receiver, which in turn is retained by a spring-loaded detent. The threading is exactly the same as the real thing, which means that faux suppressors intended to hide the 16-inch barrels of semi-auto Uzis will fit without modification. Next is the front sight, which replicates the standard Type A sight used on most production Uzis, and is adjustable for both elevation and windage. Unlocking the outer ring allows the inner post to move, and then small adjustments set the windage, while complete turns set the elevation. It's a little crude, but this isn't a long-range weapon to begin with, and it's easy enough to zero for 50 yards. Below is a foregrip. I expected generic matte black plastic, but was surprised to find that Northeast actually replicated the modeled look of the crappy brittle plastic used on the real grips. It's rare for an airsoft company to put much effort into plastic furniture, so this is a nice touch. Above the foregrip is a sling swivel, which is riveted into place. The rivet is properly seated and supports the weight of the gun as it should. Now for the top cover. This was a very tight fit out of the box, but has gradually worn in from use. It still has no play whatsoever and needs force to remove, but at least it doesn't require a mallet to get it off anymore. The charging handle features a ratcheting mechanism, which didn't work correctly out of the box, and it seems that this is actually a fairly common problem. So we put our top engineers into action, and after much tinkering managed to break the spring. So this is actually using a real Uzi ratchet spring, and now it works again, but with the caveat that it only works in full stroke. The gun is short-stroked by default, so Northeast had to extend the ratchet spring so that it could reset without traveling the full distance, and this extra unsupported length combined with it being a soft spring makes it susceptible to bending, breaking, or otherwise just failing to engage. To be clear, the gun will work totally fine if the ratcheting pawl and spring are removed, or if a top cover is used that doesn't feature the ratchet to begin with. It's just a safety mechanism, and one that is less important and less functional on the airsoft gun than the real one. We'll cover exactly how that works later, but one last thing to note here is that the charging handle features an excellent recreation of the aggressively slotted and knurled patterns of the real thing, making it easy to grip even with sweaty hands or gloves. At the rear of the receiver, the top cover is retained by a spring-loaded catch. This moves easily, but as noted before, the top cover was very tight out of the box, making it difficult to remove. After a bit of break-in, pulling the catch allows the top cover to pop up just enough to hold the catch back, and it can be pulled up the rest of the way. The rear sight is a simple pair of non-adjustable apertures. One is marked for 100 meters, and the other is marked for 200 meters. The sight is held tightly with no horizontal play, and clicks authoritatively into place in either position. Below the rear sight wing we have markings, which are shallow engravings. We have MP2A1 and caliber 9mm, indicating that this is a German contract gun, the serial number, the IMI logo with an August 1976 production date, and then lastly the Israeli and Bundeswehr acceptance stamps. All in all, everything you'd expect to see on a German contract gun. It's worth noting that all the Northeast Uzis we've seen have the same serial and date markings. These aren't unique to each gun. Moving down to the grip, the customer nationality is a little more obvious because the selector markings are German. We have S for sicher or safe, E for Einzelfeuer or semi-auto, and D for Dauerfeuer or full auto. The selector, grip, safety, and trigger are all steel. Quick correction here, the selector is not steel, but we've confirmed that real Uzi selectors aren't steel either. As mentioned before, the plastic is nicely done, and if we compare to the real Uzi grips, you can see that they're very similar. On the other side, the bolt is visible through the oversized ejection port. This is the only part visible on the exterior that is neither steel nor plastic, but the finish still looks the part, and it even has a fake extractor screw molded in. The bolt isn't quite the same color as the rest of the gun, but that's fine, because on the real ones, the bolts are heat treated differently from the receivers, so they tend not to match to begin with. The stock is the only part so far that might be worth replacing, as the Northeast stock has a fair amount of both side-to-side and up-and-down play, which cannot be fixed non-destructively because the stock assembly is riveted together. Real ones will have variable wobble depending on how much they've been used, but generally lock up reasonably tightly. Still, it's usable, and the wobble isn't noticeable when actually shouldering it. The magazines weigh about 385 grams and are composed of a steel outer shell and baseplate with cast internals. The shell and baseplate are finished the same way as the receiver, and you can see where the shell is gradually smoothed out where the mag release drags across it. In terms of appearance, this is a close replica of a real Uzi magazine. That's it for externals, and it's no exaggeration to say that this is made every bit as well as the real thing. I want to reiterate that it's not just a steel receiver, everything external besides the grips and bolt is steel down to the smallest screw. It's solid, it's clean, it's tightly toleranced, and besides the stock as mentioned, there's no rattle or wobble anywhere. There aren't many airsoft guns that still look and feel good when put next to their real counterpart, but this one does. Anyways, on to disassembly. To field strip the Uzi, first remove the top cover, then pull out the bolt and recoil spring. Next, depress the retaining catch on the muzzle nut and unscrew it. The barrel can then pull out freely. We can now use the recoil spring guide to punch out the securing pin for the grip housing. Okay, we could if we gave this a few years of hard military use. The Northeast is again very tight out of the box, so a bit of persuasion with a punch and hammer might be needed. And there we go, basic field stripping of the Uzi. Now we can go through the internals, and I should preface this by saying that this gun has had about 2,000 rounds through it, so the state of the internals reflects that level of use. The outer barrel is a single chunk of steel with a pinned collar for indexing and a cast hop unit that slides in from the chamber side. Both of these are secure with no play whatsoever, so once the barrel is tightened down by the barrel nut, all these parts stay rigid. The hop chamber and inner barrel come out with the removal of these pins, and then the hop chamber comes apart with a few screws, revealing the internals. It's a standard VSR-type barrel, 250mm long, and a VSR-type bucking. The stock barrel is of decent quality, and the stock hop setup is fairly well designed. The bucking is similar to a PDIW hold, but with an elongated contact patch, and the nub is a flat profile size to match. We did end up replacing the nub, but keeping the stock barrel and bucking, which we'll talk through when we get to performance. The hop unit itself clicks as it adjusts and stays securely in position, so there's no risk of it self-adjusting from use. Underneath the front sight is a spring tab made from a bent wire. This is a little different from its counterpart on the real thing, but serves the same functional purpose of applying tension to the top cover to prevent it from rattling or dragging on the bolt. Speaking of the bolt, as mentioned before, this is aluminum, but has steel inserts for sear engagement, reducing wear and in theory allowing replacement. The wear you see here is after about 2,000 rounds, and keep in mind this entire surface is engaged by the trigger sears, so this is really insignificant. The bolt assembly is fairly lightweight at just 211 grams, where most gas blowback ARs have between 300 and 400 grams of reciprocating mass. The nozzle is a fairly standard design, but let's walk through disassembly. First, the E-clip securing the nozzle return spring is popped off. Then 2 screws are removed from the top of the bolt, and then the nozzle and nozzle stop come right out the front. The nozzle chamber in the bolt had some sharp edges on the underside, particularly on this small spur, which seemed to be scraping the O-ring. Filing down the edges just a little corrected this. The nozzle is a pretty standard design, although the spring is a modification we made and not part of the original design. We'll come back to that. Punching out the crosspin allows the return spring to come out, but now there's a slight catch. Northeast decided to glue their nozzle shut. Fortunately, unlike some companies, they didn't cake the nozzle in glue, so after testing on a safe area to verify that the nozzle won't melt, we wick a bit of acetone into the joint and then pull while gently rocking it back and forth. After a couple rounds of this treatment, it comes apart, dumping out the rocket valve. Alright, I cheated a bit. We've already opened this one up before to adjust the rocket valve, because out of the box it actually shot too hot for us to use it at any local field. The standard rocket valve has an internal diameter of 4.75mm or about 3/16 inches, and gluing plastic tubing into the rocket valve to reduce this diameter will reduce the muzzle energy with no unwanted side effects. Once the rocket valve is restricted, the power can be increased again by boring it back out as needed. The gun does experience joule creep, so muzzle energy will depend on both the rocket valve diameter and BB weight, but we can say that reducing it to 2.8mm results in about 260 FPS with 32s, 1 joule, and 300 FPS with 2s, 0.83 joules, which is perfect for CQB. We started from about 330 FPS with 32s, which is 1.6 joules, so this is a pretty significant change. Of course, there are other ways to adjust the muzzle velocity, but this is reliable, consistent, easy to adjust, easy to reverse, and has no negative aspects on any other aspects of performance. While we're here, we should mention that Northeast is willing to sell us spare nozzles for $15 a piece, including 1 joule nozzles, so no DIY is strictly necessary. We mostly just wanted to see what sort of alteration we could make for fine-tuning. Reversing previous steps gets the nozzle back together, and then it can go back in the bolt. Here, it's necessary to align the nozzle stop with the screw holes, then insert the screws, taking care not to over-tighten, and then lastly reinsert the E-clip to secure the nozzle. Okay, that's it for the bolt. As with the real open bolt Uzi, the bolt has a single recoil spring running through it, and then unlike the real open bolt Uzi, there's a thick plastic buffer in addition to a thin rubber one. The thick buffer is a short stroke spacer and is removable, while the thin one should always be kept in the gun to soften the blow of the bolt hitting the end of its travel. The fire control group is nearly identical to that of the real Uzi, which is why the trigger pull feels so similar. On full auto, pulling the trigger simply pulls the main sear downwards, while on semi-auto, the sear is pulled downwards and then released. Note that it is possible to experience doubling if the trigger is pulled slowly, meaning it will fire more than once if the trigger is pulled just far enough to drop the sear, but not far enough for it to reset. This isn't a wear issue, it's just a quirk of this type of fire control mechanism. Also note that if the gun is set to safe, or if the grip safety is not depressed, the sear is physically blocked from dropping far enough to release the bolt, so this is a safe design to keep cocked and locked. Once again, keep in mind that this is after about 2,000 rounds, and the sear surfaces show minimal wear. Unfortunately, a real grip pack will not interchange because the Northeast needs clearance in the back for the valve knocker system, which is all of 3 parts. As the bolt comes forward, it pushes this main sear to which the valve knocker is attached, which both fires the gun and allows the valve lock to drop into position. As the bolt comes back, it trips the valve lock, resetting it. If a mag is inserted when the valve knocker is forward, it's pushed upwards against a spring, so it's safe to insert a mag on a closed bolt. This is a very simple system overall, maybe too simple, which we'll get to when we talk about performance. However, you may notice that the valve lock looks a little funny. That's because out of the box it only worked for about 50 rounds before it stopped resetting. Northeast put out a video showing that the top cover can be adjusted with a hammer, and while top cover tightness is a thing for real Uzis, it's not the actual culprit here. And when we did try that method, we found that getting it tight enough to reset the sear made it too tight on the bolt. The bolt needs to have enough room to travel across its entire linear track without binding, and then the valve lock also needs to be tall enough to trip reliably, which required shimming. We simply scuffed the surface with sandpaper for a bit of tooth, then epoxied on a shim made from a soda can, and that works for now. This is a significant problem, but Northeast has already redesigned the valve lock and is sending replacements for free to current owners, so this shouldn't be an issue in the future. That's about it for internals on the gun, so onto the magazine, which is a reasonably standard design. First, the end plate slides off, exposing the screw which secures the outer shell to the inner body. The tab it goes through is a very thin part, so putting excess pressure on the inner body, for example by pressing with a gas can when filling, will bend this tab upwards and allow the inner body to push out the top of the shell. So it's a good idea to support the underside of the mag when filling. Anyways, with that screw removed, the inner body slides out the top. Taking out the other screw then allows the body to disassemble into the top, middle, and end plate. At the top is a typical valve design, but a conspicuous lack of a bolt catch lever. The feed lips are also pretty standard, but don't play nicely with any of our speed loaders. The best we found is a pen-style speed loader held at a 45-degree angle, and even that isn't great. Northeast has shared with us that they plan to release revised feed lip design soon, so that may improve things, and Comrade Quiche makes a speed loader adapter as well. Behind the feed lips is a dry fire switch. It's very difficult to move, but it does work as advertised. The follower is interesting in that it's a solid chunk of cast pot metal. However, there are two sources of feed issues we've observed relating to the follower. First, the geometry of the current feed lips makes the magazine sensitive to excess friction in the feed track, which is why we've polished most of the contact surfaces on the follower to prevent it from binding. And second, the follower can hang up as it moves from the middle section of the feed track to the upper section. Northeast is replacing mags that experience this issue, but they shared with us pictures of the necessary fixes. It's really just chamfering the inner surfaces of the upper section so that the follower doesn't bind, which can be done with just a small file, and that's sort of the issue. Now there's something funky going on with the spring guide. There are two of them. In addition to the bottom one, which is threaded for the screw that secures the outer shell, there's also what appears to be a 3D printed guide pinned just a little higher. This is what limits the capacity of the magazine to 32 rounds, and if it's removed, then the capacity increases to 44. With the marginal feeding of some of these magazines, though, we're keeping ours pinned to 32 for that extra bit of spring tension. If Northeast's new feed lips end up solving that issue, then we may revisit this decision. In the meantime, we should point out that in another review, it was suggested to spray oil into the magazine to fix feed issues. Look, the hop-up struggles enough as it is, and oil accumulates dust that will clog it right back up again. Please don't do this. It's not worth it. Anyways, the last thing to talk about with mags is how stop on empty works. When the mag runs out of BBs, the nozzle slams into the follower. Seriously, that's all there is to it. Before getting the gun, we were concerned that this would break either the nozzle or the follower, which was apparently a fairly common issue on the Northeast Sten, but this seems like a more robust design. And we should also note that 2 out of 6 of our magazines leaked on arrival, but just a bit of grease on the O-ring sorted that out and they're holding gas just fine now. So to recap, these are all the functional issues we ran into before getting into actually shooting it. The charging handle ratchet didn't work out of the box, but a real spring got it functioning, albeit in full stroke only. Next, the nozzle chamber still had a sharp edge from machining. This was a 30-second fix. The valve lock is too short and needed to be shimmed. Northeast is making a replacement and sending it for free to existing owners. The magazine followers bind due to the multi-part mag body. Northeast is fixing this on affected mags and correcting it in the future. And mags are hard to load and feed reliability could be better. Northeast is producing a new design of feed lips that hopefully should address these concerns, and again sending it for free to existing owners. So overall that's a pretty rough launch, but Northeast does seem to be listening and making improvements, and that's a good sign at least. Now's a good time to mention that the gun comes from Northeast with an exploded view of the parts, and the manual has a similar diagram for the magazine. This is pretty standard for gas guns, but if you look closely, most of the basic O-rings, screws, pins, washers, and E-clips don't have parts numbers. Instead, they have specifications, taking the guesswork out of buying off-the-shelf replacements. Not all the parts have specifications, and we would not suggest buying a new nozzle, just get a new O-ring for it, but this is still a nice gesture by Northeast. Well, on to how it operates. First, to unfold the stock, just pull down to unlock and swing both sections out to lock them in place. You can slap the stock if you think that looks cool, but most Uzi stocks don't actually lock up tightly enough for that to be necessary, and the Northeast doesn't require much force at all. To fold the stock up again, push the locking button by the receiver to fold the stock down, squeeze the lower section to collapse it, push the upper section up against the receiver, and then push the lower section upwards to lock it in place. It might sound complicated, but it's easy with a bit of practice. The magazine releases at the bottom of the grip. Unlike the heel release on an Ingram that can be accidentally pushed by squeezing the grip too hard, the flush-fitting design here is secure and requires a conscious effort to engage. For a right-handed shooter, it's easy to depress with a thumb, and for a wrong-handed shooter, using the index finger works well enough. In theory, it's possible to drop the mag with the shooting hand, but it's awkward and this really isn't how the gun is meant to be used. When inserting a magazine, the magazine catch may require some effort to get past, but this will break in over time or can be lightly filed to smooth it out. Next is the grip safety, because it locks you out from doing much of anything with the gun unless it's depressed. Without the grip safety depressed, the gun cannot be fired, and also cannot be charged. This safety moves smoothly, doesn't bind, and has just enough tension to reset reliably without requiring a deft grip to actuate, so it's pretty foolproof. When you need it to work, it works, as long as you're holding the grip firmly. The selector was very stiff at first, but after a bit of break-in, clicks nicely between settings without overrunning them. This isn't the sort of weapon you constantly flick on and off safe during a firefight, but it's not too hard to get into semi when the shooting starts. Note that if the safety is on safe, the bolt again cannot be charged. So in order to charge the gun, it's necessary to switch it to semi or full auto, depress the grip safety, and then rack the charging handle, and this is where that ratcheting mechanism is relevant. As with a real open bolt Uzi, if a loaded mag is inserted and the charging handle pulled back partway, but not far enough to engage the sear, the ratcheting mechanism will catch the charging handle and prevent the bolt from going forward. If the ratcheting mechanism is malfunctioning, gone, or never present to begin with, the gun will instead negligently discharge. Oops. Now obviously this is less of a liability with an airsoft gun than a real one. Usually the nozzle stays in the hot bucking, so this will dry fire rather than actually discharge a BB, and the risk of accidentally slipping off the charging handle is very slim, but it's something to be aware of. And note that even if the ratcheting mechanism is working, there's another wrinkle to it, because the ratcheting mechanism doesn't start to engage until just before the bolt clears the magazine. So if you're planning to carry with the bolt forward to keep dust and debris out, just be aware that this is a possibility. Otherwise, if the bolt is always locked back before mag is inserted, it's not an issue and the ratchet can be removed. The trigger is, technically, a two-stage pull with a short first stage, a longer and heavier second stage, and an indeterminate break. It has a long reset with an audible and tactile clunk. This is a terrible trigger, but it's an authentically terrible one, matching the feel and behavior of the real thing perfectly. And lastly, hop adjustment is performed by removing the barrel and turning the adjustment dial. It can also be accessed by removing the top cover and bolt, but this is the easier way to do it. Alright, now let's actually shoot the thing. Gas up a mag, load it to 32 BBs, and well, it shoots. But frankly, there isn't a lot of kick. The entire gun weighs 7 pounds loaded, but the total reciprocating mass is only about 2/3 that of a typical gas blowback AR, so lower reciprocating mass, higher overall mass, not a lot of momentum transfer. The open bolt operation also gives the recoil a bit of an inverted feeling, similar to the Tippmann M4, because the weight is first slamming forward and then recoiling back. Our simple rocket valve modification brought it down to 1 joule for CQB use, and it stays close to that value until it cools down substantially. In terms of efficiency, continuous semi-auto fire on propane at 72 Fahrenheit fired a total of 78 shots before the gun could no longer cycle. When fired in strings of 32 at a time, and given 3 minutes to rest between each string of fire, the gun was able to manage 157 shots before it ran out. This doubling in efficiency is probably in part because the steel shell and high surface area of the magazines helps with heat transfer, so giving it time to warm up makes a huge difference. And for the third test, in bursts of full auto fire, we are pretty consistently able to get through 1 full mag no problem. Then after allowing it to warm back up to ambient temperature, it can struggle through a second mag, but that's it. Still, this is good enough that we could see a steel bolt being practical, which would also help address the lack of recoil. Now we move to accuracy testing, and this is where we ran into a major problem. Out of the box, we simply could not get it to hop consistently, with BBs often curving to the side or severely over or under hopping. We didn't record a grouping because at just 20 yards, we were struggling to get it on paper. So we tried swapping in a known good bucking and barrel combination, and that actually made it worse. After about 8 hours of experimentation, we isolated this poor performance to the open bolt system. Essentially, the bolt trips the valve knocker before it's fully forward, so the BB is still being pushed by the nozzle and never comes to a stop in the hop-up before it fires. The result is that the BB is not starting in a consistent position and has some random spin from feeding. Most open-bolt airsoft guns have some kind of delayer mechanism to address this issue. In the KWA-M11, the nozzle and barrel travel a few millimeters together before gas is released. The WE Thompson has a simpler fix in that a spring on the nozzle keeps it a few millimeters forwards, with the bolt compressing onto the nozzle as the valve knocker trips. So, copying that approach, we carefully drilled a hole into the back of the nozzle and glued in a small section of compression spring. This produced a massive improvement, and we were able to get a decent group on paper at 20 yards, but still were experiencing occasional random overhop and underhop, which made shooting at distance difficult. Swapping in a Maple Leaf Omega nub to replace the stock one seems to have solved that particular issue, producing a group consistently about 4 inches across. And for the sake of isolating variables, we then tried removing the spring, and the gun went right back to regularly over and under hopping. Now we have heard from others online that they've gotten good results from very specific hop part combinations, so further experimentation is warranted, and we cannot provide a definite upgrade recommendation at this time. Well, when we're done shooting, all that's needed as far as basic maintenance is just wiping down the bolt and reapplying grease to visible contact points on the bolt. It's particularly important to do this regularly as the gun breaks in, because that nice parkerized finish wearing down at contact points turns grease or oil into abrasive sludge. For more long-term maintenance, the nozzle should be periodically removed and its O-ring re-greased, and the barrel should be swabbed out with isopropyl to clean it. Overall, pretty easy stuff. For the magazines, it's only necessary to touch them if they leak, and for that, please refer to our gas mag maintenance guide. And we do have a few more general performance notes to cover. First, know that we've been using full stroke in all these tests, meaning the short stroke buffer has been removed. This has negligible impact on the already weak felt recoil and reduces the rate of fire from about 1000 RPM to about 750 RPM. Most importantly, it significantly increases the amount of time between when the nozzle retracts and when the nozzle strips the next BB from the magazine, and this seems to dramatically improve magazine feed reliability. It is physically possible to reduce the overall travel of the nozzle to give it a better chance of cycling, but frankly we'd suggest just removing the short stroke buffer and calling it a day. Just to be clear, there's no difference in efficiency between short stroke and full stroke. We're not sure where the myth got started that short stroke makes a gun more efficient, but there's absolutely no truth to it. The bolt will trip the valve lock and cut off the flow of gas at the same point in the blowback cycle, regardless of how much additional overtravel it has. Then there's the issue of lock time. Basically, on an open bolt gun, there is a delay between when the trigger is pulled and when the gun actually fires. Using slow motion video, we've determined this delay to be about 0.06 seconds. For point of comparison, that's about the same as the delay you get between pulling the trigger and when it actually fires on an AEG with a rate of fire of around 16 rounds per second. So not a fantastic trigger response, but it is still possible to fire reasonably quickly on semi. Note that short stroke versus full stroke has no impact on lock time because they both start from the same position. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the practicality of actually using this gun for airsoft. First things first, as mentioned before, this weighs 7 pounds loaded, and even that's a little bit lighter than the real thing at about 9 pounds loaded. We know scale can be hard to judge from pictures online, so we want to stress that this is not a compact machine pistol or PDW, it's pretty much a 1940s submachine gun squished down, and so overbuilt that it weighs as much as a loaded AK. You're not carrying this in a holster, you're not stashing it away as a sidearm, and you can shoot it one-handed, but unless you're an Austrian bodybuilder, probably not for long. This is a primary weapon, so plan accordingly. So, the easiest way to carry the Uzi is on a sling, and it can be carried safely when set to fire with the bolt forward and a mag inserted. In this state, it cannot be fired without first charging it, and it cannot be charged without first depressing the grip safety. This means a gun can be carried with no ingress points for foreign debris, but can be made ready to fire just by grabbing the pistol grip and cycling the bolt. As mentioned before, the act of charging it carries some risk of a negligent discharge, particularly if the ratcheting mechanism has been removed, but between the relatively weak spring and the aggressive patterning on the charging handle, you would really have to try to slip off of it. Next, the manual of arms for an open bolt firearm might take some getting used to. When a mag runs empty, it's easy to recock the bolt, remove the magazine, and insert a new one, all without removing the dominant hand from the grip. As far as submachine guns go, this is significantly faster than the H&K slap, and brings the gun back into action quicker than many more modern closed bolt systems. Hand meets hand is an intuitive system, and it's easy to reload without looking at the gun. Tactical reloads aren't too tough, but you'll need to get in the habit of grabbing mags all the way at the base if you don't already. The sights are a fairly narrow aperture, so while this works fine for outdoor use in good lighting, it is very difficult to see the front sight in CQB or under canopy cover. Enlarging the aperture is one option if you don't want to resort to point shooting, or turning to an aftermarket optics mount is another. One other potential issue is that it's very difficult to align to the sights when wearing any kind of face protection. Again, an elevated optic is one way around it, or a different stock. And that brings us to real steel parts. Pretty much everything is a drop-in fit, but the Northeast parts are sufficiently high quality that it isn't necessary to replace everything, so there are a few specific areas of interest. First, as already mentioned, the muzzle nut threading is the same as the real thing, so faux suppressors intended for real Uzis will fit without modification. There are also alternative foregrips, such as the K grip developed for Israeli Special Forces. Since there's no muzzle rise to control, this is a matter of personal preference, but if you have a suppressor adding weight to the front of the gun, a different grip may help ergonomically. If the gun is being used on full stroke, then replacing the top cover, or at least just the ratcheting spring, isn't a bad idea. Top covers are readily available as surplus, so this is a fairly cheap swap, but remember that a real ratcheting mechanism will only work in full stroke, and top covers intended for closed-bolt semi-auto Uzis will not have a ratcheting mechanism at all. Next, optics mounts are useful, as the stock irons are pretty crude. If you're considering a replacement top cover already, you could get one with an integral rail while you're at it. For a more retro look, Armson USA still manufactures occluded eye gun sights intended specifically for the Uzi, and there are a bunch of commercial clamp-on rails from the 1980s and 1990s. These will attach to the Northeast top cover without modification, but note that many were designed for closed-bolt Uzis and may not permit the charging handle to go far enough for the ratcheting system to disengage. And last, alternative stocks. The quick-detach wood stocks have a slightly shorter length of pull and make for a better cheek weld than the metal folding stock. Admittedly, the main advantage doesn't apply to airsoft, which is that recoil doesn't feel like getting whacked in the cheekbone with a lawnmower blade, but the lower dip in the comb does make it easier to align with the sights when wearing face protection. To remove the folding stock, simply remove the bolt and recoil spring assembly, unscrew the bolt holding the stock into the receiver, then pull out the mounting nut from the inside. The wood stock then hooks onto the locking tab and slides into the hole in the receiver. They fit with minimal filing at most, and are pretty cheap as surplus, so we highly recommend giving one a try. And of course, if the Northeast folding stock has too much wobble for your tastes, a surplus one is a drop-in fit. Alright, at this point we've covered just about everything, so let's rate it using our patented 7-point unbounded non-Euclidean Likert scale with Punnett square of course, according to 6 arbitrary scoring metrics, or we can just summarize pros and cons and you can make up your own mind. This is an exceptionally well-built replica that duplicates the look and feel of the real thing almost perfectly, with superb attention to detail and real steel compatibility. It does have significant functional issues out of the box, but most are fixable and Northeast is already making improvements. That leaves just performance, and this is a mixed bag. With nozzle modification, it shoots quite well, and we expect most airsofters will be satisfied with accuracy and efficiency, but without that modification, the accuracy was very poor. It also doesn't have much in terms of recoil, and the open bolt operation makes the recoil impulse a bit odd, so this is not really a gun to buy for the raw experience of shooting it. But most importantly, it's an Uzi. So if you've been excited for a full steel gas Uzi replica, then that may be all the experience you need. And finally, that brings us to price. At $450 plus shipping from East Asia, this is not a cheap piece. But for comparison, a full steel WE MP5 costs $330 to $500, a VFC MP5 is $480, or a KWA M11 with steel body kit runs at least $400 nowadays. The price is fairly appropriate for what it is. Magazines are $50 a piece, which is right in line with other gas submachine gun mags. All in all, the Northeast MP2A1 is a well-built and potentially great airsoft gun, let down by a rough launch. But most of the issues are easily fixable, and if Northeast continues to deliver on improvements, we expect these will be quite popular. We'll plan to do a follow-up in a few months to report on how that goes, but that's all for today, so thanks for watching.